For Terry and Gwen Sherman, every passing day on the ranch had become another test of endurance. The strange events that at once seemed isolated had grown into an endless cycle of fear, confusion, and emotional exhaustion. Their livestock had vanished or been found mutilated. Unexplained lights crossed the sky. Massive creatures appeared where no animal should exist. Every attempt to make sense of the nightmare had failed. By the beginning of 1996, the family had reached a devastating conclusion. They could no longer continue living on land that seemed determined to drive them away. The ranch, once meant to provide security and a future for their children, had become a place that threatened both their financial survival and their peace of mind. Yet despite everything they had experienced, they still had no explanation for what was happening. At almost the same moment the Shernans were debating whether to abandon the property forever, events were unfolding hundreds of miles away that would completely change the story. In March of 1996, billionaire businessman and real estate developer Robert Bigelow was assembling an organization unlike anything that had existed before. His vision was ambitious, expensive, and, unlike the typical paranormal groups that relied on speculation or sensational stories, he wanted a professional scientific team capable of investigating reports of highly unusual activity anywhere in the United States with the same discipline used in mainstream research. The organization became known as the National Institute for Discovery Science, better known simply as NIDS. Its purpose was straightforward but extraordinarily challenging. Anytime credible reports of highly unusual activity surfaced anywhere in the United States, NIDS would be prepared to deploy trained investigators equipped with advanced scientific instruments. Their objective was not to prove the paranormal existed. Instead, they intended to collect measurable evidence, eliminate ordinary explanations first, and only then consider possibilities that lay outside conventional science. This philosophy shaped every decision Bigelow made while building the organization. Rather than recruiting people who already believed every extraordinary claim they heard, he specifically searched for scientists who approached mysteries with skepticism. They were expected to question every witness, challenge every assumption, and exhaust every normal explanation before accepting that an event truly defied understanding. The team reflected that philosophy. Among its members were respected professors and researchers holding doctorate degrees in disciplines that included biochemistry, psychology, astrophysics, veterinary medicine, and several other scientific specialties. These were professionals who had built careers through evidence, experimentation, and critical thinking, not sensationalism. To strengthen the project even further, Bigelow assembled an advisory board made up of experts from numerous academic and technical fields. Evidence collected by field investigators would later be reviewed and debated by these specialists before any conclusions were considered. In total, the organization eventually consisted of more than 25 members. Most came from scientific backgrounds, while others had experience in military operations and security, allowing the team to safely conduct investigations in isolated or potentially dangerous environments. Among the researchers who would become most closely associated with the ranch were physicist Eric Davis and biochemist Dr. Colm Kelleher. Years later, Kelleher would help document everything the Shermans experienced, as well as the remarkable events witnessed by the NIDS investigators themselves, in the influential book Hunt for the Skinwalker, written alongside investigative journalist George Knapp. Not long after NIDS officially began operations, stories about an isolated ranch in northeastern Utah started attracting attention. Earlier that year, Terry Sherman had reluctantly contacted a local newspaper. He wasn't searching for fame. He wasn't trying to convince people that aliens or monsters existed. In fact, Terry remained deeply skeptical of both extraterrestrial theories and Native American legends connected to the area. His own suspicion was very different. He believed that whatever was happening on his property might somehow involve secret military technology. If classified experiments were being conducted nearby, perhaps bringing public attention to the ranch would encourage whoever was responsible to stop. For Terry, speaking publicly wasn't an attempt to create a mystery. It was a desperate plea for someone, anyone, to help explain what was destroying his family's life. Those newspaper reports eventually reached Robert Bigelow. In the summer of 1996, he called together members of NIDS to discuss the remarkable claims coming out of Utah. As they reviewed the reports, one possibility quickly became impossible to ignore. If even a fraction of the Shermans' experiences were genuine, this isolated ranch represented something extraordinary. Instead of chasing isolated eyewitness accounts across the country, investigators would have access to a single location where multiple unexplained phenomena reportedly occurred over and over again. It offered exactly the kind of real-world laboratory NIDS had been created to study. Hidden away from busy cities and public interference, the property could allow scientists to observe unusual events in their natural environment with professional equipment and around-the-clock monitoring. For Bigelow and his team, the opportunity was simply too significant to overlook. Within only a few weeks, representatives from NIDS met face-to-face with the Sherman family. The investigators listened carefully as Terry and Gwen described everything they had endured over the previous 2 years. Many of the stories sounded almost unbelievable, yet the sincerity of the family and the consistency of their accounts left a powerful impression. After lengthy discussions, NIDS presented the Shermans with an unexpected proposal. They wanted to purchase the ranch. For Gwen and the children, the decision seemed obvious. Leaving the property meant escaping years of fear and uncertainty. Never returning would have been more than enough. Terry, however, struggled with the idea. The ranch represented years of sacrifice and hard work. Walking away felt like surrendering to whatever had invaded his land. Even worse, he still had no answers. He hated the thought of abandoning his home without ever learning what had truly happened there. But protecting his family mattered more. Reluctantly, Terry agreed to sell. Even so, he wasn't ready to completely separate himself from the investigation. He made NIDS an offer. If they purchased the ranch, he wanted to remain as its manager. His experience operating the property would be valuable, and more importantly, it would allow him to witness the investigation firsthand. Perhaps after everything his family had suffered, science might finally uncover the truth. NIDS accepted without hesitation. The researchers understood scientific instruments. Running a working cattle ranch was a completely different challenge. Keeping Terry involved benefited everyone. As preparations for the investigation began, neither the Shermans nor the scientists realized they were entering one of the most disturbing paranormal investigations ever documented. And before long, the ranch itself would begin to reveal that its darkest secrets had only just begun. By September 1996, the ranch had entered a completely different chapter. Large trailers carrying scientific equipment rolled through the entrance gate, replacing the Sherman family's ordinary farm vehicles. One trailer served as a mobile laboratory, packed with analytical instruments, while another became the investigators' headquarters. From this point forward, the property would no longer be simply a working cattle ranch. It had become one of the most unusual scientific field stations in America. A permanent team of researchers and assistant investigators settled onto the land, working in rotating shifts so that someone was always present, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Every observation, no matter how insignificant it appeared, would be logged, measured, photographed, and compared against scientific data. Each month, the evidence gathered in the field would be presented to the NIDES Advisory Board for independent review. Nothing would be accepted without careful examination. The investigators understood one important rule from the very beginning. Extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence. Before considering anything supernatural, they first needed to eliminate every ordinary explanation. Their investigation, therefore, started not with cameras aimed at the sky, but with science. The researchers collected soil samples from every major section of the ranch. Water from wells, streams, and storage tanks was analyzed for chemical contamination. Plants growing across the property were carefully examined to determine whether any naturally occurring spores or toxins might produce hallucinations in humans or livestock. Air quality measurements were taken repeatedly throughout different seasons. Veterinary specialists examined the animals. Environmental scientists searched for geological abnormalities. Engineers measured magnetic activity. Physicists monitored radiation levels. Psychologists reviewed the Shermans' accounts while considering whether stress, isolation, or shared psychological factors could have influenced what the family believed they had witnessed. The team also investigated the possibility that underground fault lines might be creating subtle seismic stress. Some researchers had proposed that tectonic activity could occasionally produce unusual lights in the atmosphere, or even affect human perception. If such conditions existed beneath the ranch, they might explain at least part of the mystery. Electromagnetic fields became another major focus. Strong electromagnetic exposure has sometimes been associated with feelings of unease, confusion, or the sensation that someone is nearby. Investigators carefully mapped the entire property, searching for abnormal readings that could account for the Shermans' frightening experiences. They also tested for infrasound, extremely low-frequency sound waves below the range of human hearing. Although people cannot consciously hear infrasound, previous studies suggested it could trigger anxiety, nausea, discomfort, or even the disturbing feeling that an unseen presence was nearby. If invisible sound waves were affecting everyone on the ranch, perhaps the mystery had an entirely natural explanation. Weeks of testing slowly turned into months. Data accumulated. Laboratory reports arrived. Measurements were repeated again and again. One possible explanation after another quietly disappeared. The water was clean. No hallucinogenic plant life capable of mass experiences was identified. Radiation remained within normal limits. No significant electromagnetic anomaly consistently appeared across the property. No environmental factor explained missing cattle, mutilated animals, mysterious lights, or enormous unidentified creatures. Psychological explanations proved equally difficult. The investigators found no evidence suggesting that the Sherman family had fabricated their experiences for publicity or financial gain. Nor did they uncover any pattern indicating mass delusion or mass hysteria. The family's accounts remained remarkably consistent despite extensive questioning. For scientists trained to solve problems through evidence, this deeply unsettling result simply removed another possible answer. By the end of 1996, however, the ranch itself seemed unusually quiet. Apart from occasional unexplained lights drifting across the night sky, very little happened. Days turned into weeks without dramatic incidents. The field investigators began wondering whether the extraordinary stories they had heard might have been exaggerated after all. Some privately questioned whether the ranch's reputation had grown larger than reality. Perhaps the unusual events had already ended. Perhaps the Shermans had simply experienced an unfortunate series of unrelated incidents that had become increasingly sensational over time. Even Terry sensed the growing skepticism. He understood why. If he hadn't lived through the previous 2 years himself, he probably wouldn't have believed the stories either. Still, something about the silence felt wrong. The ranch had changed before. It could change again. As winter slowly gave way to spring, the investigators continued their daily routines. Equipment remained in place. Observation logs continued filling with ordinary entries. Livestock grazed peacefully across the fields. For a brief moment, it almost appeared as though the mystery had ended before the investigation truly began. But beneath that calm surface, something else seemed to be waiting. The silence wasn't the conclusion of the story. It was merely the pause before everything became far more disturbing. Within a few months, the investigators who had arrived believing science would quickly explain the ranch would experience events that challenged everything they thought they knew. And the first shocking incident would begin not with strange lights in the sky, but with the horrifying discovery of a dead calf lying in an open pasture.
On the morning of March 9, 1997, the quiet routine of the ranch was shattered in a way that left both the investigators and the Sherman family stunned. Although Terry and Gwen no longer lived on the property, Terry still managed the ranch for NIDS, and Gwen occasionally returned to help with livestock. That day seemed perfectly ordinary. The sky was clear, the cattle were calm, and nothing hinted that another disturbing mystery was about to unfold. The couple had been working in one of the pastures, tagging newborn calves. One particular Black Angus calf had just received its identification tag. After completing the task, Terry and Gwen walked roughly 300 yards away to inspect and tag several other calves grazing farther south. It was routine ranch work they had performed countless times before. A ranch dog accompanied them as they worked. Without warning, the animal froze. Its ears stood upright. The hair along its back rose. A deep, uneasy growl escaped its throat as it stared toward the direction of the ranch house. Years of working around animals had taught Terry never to ignore behavior like that. Dogs often sense danger long before humans did. Following the dog's gaze, Terry and Gwen noticed something strange. The mother of the calf they had tagged less than an hour earlier was pacing nervously across the pasture. She limped in circles, repeatedly stopping and looking toward the same spot on the ground. Her behavior was frantic. She appeared terrified. The couple immediately hurried toward her. What they discovered stopped them in their tracks. The calf lay motionless on the grass. Its body had been subjected to one of the most disturbing mutilations either of them had ever seen. The entire abdominal cavity had been emptied. Nearly all of the internal organs were gone. More than 60 pounds of tissue had somehow disappeared. Only the head, legs, spinal column, and portions of the rib cage remained. Even more disturbing, one of the calf's ears had been removed with what appeared to be an incredibly clean, razor-like cut. That missing ear was the very one that had held the identification tag Terry had attached less than 45 minutes earlier. Whatever had happened occurred in boarlight daylight, within sight of the ranch, during a period when Terry and Gwen had been working only a short distance away, yet neither of them heard a struggle. No cries, no movement, no signs of predators, nothing. As shocking as the mutilation itself was, another detail proved even more difficult to explain. There wasn't a single visible pool of blood surrounding the carcass. The grass beneath the animal appeared almost untouched. Anyone familiar with livestock knew that an injury of this magnitude should have produced an enormous amount of blood. Instead, the scene looked unnaturally clean. The NIDS team was immediately notified. Their veterinary specialist carefully examined the remains before collecting tissue samples for laboratory analysis. His conclusions raised even more questions. The incisions appeared remarkably smooth and precise. There were no jagged tears that would normally indicate an attack by coyotes, wolves, mountain lions, or scavenging animals. From a veterinary standpoint, no known predator matched what he observed. When investigators interviewed Terry and Gwen once again, they asked a simple question. Had anything unusual occurred before they discovered the calf? The answer surprised everyone. Both described noticing an overpowering musky odor lingering in the area shortly before reaching the carcass. It wasn't the smell of cattle. It wasn't a familiar wildlife scent. Neither of them could identify its source. The strange odor would later become one of several recurring details reported during unexplained events on the ranch. While the veterinarian continued documenting the mutilation, other investigators spread across the surrounding pasture looking for evidence. They searched for footprints, signs of predators, vehicle tracks, anything that might explain what had happened. The search produced almost nothing. No clear trail led toward or away from the carcass. The ground revealed no obvious struggle. It was as though whatever had removed such a large amount of tissue had arrived and departed without leaving meaningful evidence behind. As several investigators walked past one of the observation towers, another curious detail caught their attention. Inside a fenced enclosure beneath the tower were several trained dogs. Normally energetic and alert, every one of them had crowded into the deepest corner of the kennel. None would come outside. The animals appeared frightened. Some trembled quietly. Others refused to even look toward the pasture where the mutilation had occurred. These weren't ordinary ranch pets. NIDS had intentionally positioned dogs at different observation points because investigators believed canines often reacted to unusual activity before people noticed anything themselves. Over time, the researchers had begun treating the dogs as living biological warning systems. Whenever something unexplained occurred, the animals often behaved differently. Terry quietly mentioned something else. The dogs hadn't left their shelters at all that day. In fact, they had remained unusually fearful since early morning. What disturbed him even more was that this behavior didn't end after the mutilation. For days afterwards, the animals continued refusing to venture far from their kennels. It was almost as if they sensed that whatever had visited the pasture was still somewhere nearby. At the time, no one could explain their behavior. But the investigators carefully documented every detail, because experience had already taught them one lesson. On Skinwalker Ranch, even the smallest observation could later become an important piece of a much larger puzzle. 3 nights later, the frightened behavior of those dogs would suddenly make terrifying sense. Late in the darkness, something lurking beyond the trees would reveal itself, and Terry Sherman would come face to face with a creature unlike anything he had ever encountered before.
Just before 11 p.m. on March 12, 1997, the uneasy silence that had settled over the ranch was broken. From inside the observation trailer, Terry Sherman and several members of the NIDS field team suddenly heard an eruption of frantic barking. The dogs stationed near one of the observation towers weren't making their usual territorial noise. Their barks carried a different tone, sharp, desperate, and filled with fear. Within seconds, the investigators were moving. Flashlights, radios, cameras, and weapons were grabbed as the group climbed into a 4-wheel drive truck equipped with a powerful roof-mounted spotlight. Terry took the driver's seat, already convinced that something unusual had triggered the animals. The truck rumbled across the dark pasture toward the source of the disturbance. As they rounded a bend, the beam from the spotlight swept across a stand of towering cottonwood trees in the distance. Then everyone saw them. 2 glowing yellow circles reflected brightly from high above the ground. They weren't lights, they were eyes. The enormous eyes appeared to be nearly 20 feet up in the branches of one of the trees, staring directly back at the approaching vehicle. For a brief moment, nobody spoke. The investigators simply watched. Whatever was perched in that tree remained perfectly still. Terry immediately recognized the danger. Only days earlier, a calf had been mutilated under circumstances no one could explain. If this creature was responsible, he wasn't about to let it escape. Without taking his eyes off the tree, he reached behind the seat and retrieved his rifle. Stepping carefully out of the truck, he rested the weapon against the open driver's door to steady his aim. Looking through the scope, he could finally make out part of the creature's outline. It was huge, far larger than any ordinary predator found in the area. "I'm not letting it kill another calf," he muttered. What unsettled him most wasn't its appearance, it was its behavior. The creature showed absolutely no fear. It didn't attempt to hide, it didn't climb down, it didn't run. Instead, it simply continued watching him, almost as if it knew exactly what he was about to do. Terry squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked through the night. Instantly, the glowing eyes disappeared. A heavy impact echoed beneath the tree as something large crashed through the branches and struck the ground. Everyone heard it. Convinced the animal had fallen, Terry jumped back into the truck. The investigators drove straight toward the cottonwoods, expecting to find either the wounded animal or its body lying beneath the tree. Instead, there was nothing. No animal, no movement, no blood, no broken branches that suggested where it had landed. The ground appeared strangely empty. The investigators spread out, forming a loose search line as they entered the dark grove. Their flashlights swept across the undergrowth. Every shadow seemed alive. Every snapped twig made someone turn. The forest had become unusually quiet. Then Terry shouted, "I've got it!" The team rushed toward his voice. Before anyone reached him, 2 more rifle shots exploded through the trees. Somewhere ahead, something enormous crashed violently through thick brush. Branches snapped, leaves shook, heavy footsteps pounded deeper into the darkness. By the time the investigators reached Terry, whatever had fled was already gone. Breathing heavily, Terry pointed into the woods. "It looked like a massive dog," he said. Then he paused. "But it was moving like a person." Those words hung in the cold night air. No one immediately responded. The investigators spent nearly an hour searching every section of the grove. They expected to find blood from Terry's shots, hair, a wounded animal, anything. They found none of it. Eventually, one of the investigators noticed impressions in the soft earth. There were only 2 clear footprints, each measured approximately 14 inches long. Deep claw marks extended from the front of both prints. Even stranger, the tracks were separated by nearly 20 feet. Whatever had made them had covered an impossible distance in a single stride. The impressions ended almost as suddenly as they had begun. Beyond them, nothing. No continuing trail, no sign of where the creature had gone. The investigators carefully photographed and measured the prints before documenting every detail. Despite the bizarre evidence, no known animal matched what they had witnessed that night. The encounter left the team deeply unsettled. Several investigators privately admitted that they had never experienced anything remotely similar. For scientists trained to rely on observation and evidence, the night's events challenged every expectation they had brought with them. The weeks that followed were comparatively quiet. No further encounters with the mysterious creature were reported. Yet, something across the ranch had undeniably changed. The livestock behaved differently. The horses startled more easily. Cattle remained unusually nervous, and the dogs never truly relaxed. They carried themselves as though an invisible predator still wandered somewhere beyond the fence lines, watching, waiting. Then, on April 1st, the mystery took another disturbing turn. One more calf vanished without leaving behind a single trace. No blood, no tracks, no struggle, it simply ceased to exist. Less than 24 hours later, an even stranger event would unfold, one that involved 4 massive black Angus bulls seemingly appearing inside a locked trailer where they should never have been able to enter.
For the NIDS investigators, it would become one of the most baffling incidents ever documented on Skinwalker Ranch.
The unsettling encounter in the cottonwood trees left everyone on the ranch on edge, but the mystery was only becoming more complex. As March came to an end, the atmosphere around the property felt unusually tense. Ranch animals behaved as though danger lingered just beyond sight. Horses startled at invisible disturbances, dogs refused to roam freely after dark. Even the cattle seemed unusually restless, often bunching together for no obvious reason. Then, on April 1st, 1997, another mystery unfolded. One of the calves simply vanished. Unlike previous mutilation cases, there was no carcass to examine. No blood stained the ground, no tracks led away from the pasture, no signs of predators or human involvement could be found. One moment the calf was grazing with the herd, the next it was gone. The disappearance baffled both Terry and Gwen and the NIDS investigators. Every inch of the surrounding fields was searched, but the animal had seemingly been erased without leaving behind the slightest clue. It was an impossible event. Yet an even stranger incident was waiting less than 24 hours away. On the morning of April 2nd, Terry had temporarily returned 4 of his prized Black Angus breeding bulls to the ranch. These weren't ordinary cattle. Each animal represented years of careful breeding and was worth thousands of dollars. Together, the 4 bulls were among the most valuable livestock Terry owned. Because of the recent disappearances and mutilations, both Terry and Gwen worried constantly about them. That morning, the couple drove across the ranch to repair sections of damaged fencing and check on several newborn calves. As they passed the main corral beside the homestead, they glanced toward the enclosure. All 4 bulls stood quietly inside. Seeing them safe brought Terry a small measure of relief. Gwen looked at the animals and sighed. "I'd be heartbroken if anything happened to those bulls," she remarked. Neither of them realized how strangely those words would soon echo back at them. They continued to the western side of the ranch. Repairing the broken fence took little time. They also tagged a pair of calves born during the previous night before climbing back into the truck. The entire trip had lasted no more than an hour. Driving back toward the homestead, Terry rounded the familiar bend in the ranch road. Almost immediately, something felt wrong. The corral looked empty. His eyes darted across the enclosure. The 4 bulls were gone. Terry slammed the truck to a stop. Before the vehicle had completely halted, he jumped out and sprinted toward the fence. His heart pounded as he reached the gate. It was still securely locked. No hinges had been damaged, no chain had been cut. Nothing suggested anyone or anything had entered or left the enclosure. Yet the bulls had completely disappeared. Panic quickly replaced confusion. Those animals represented a tremendous financial investment. After everything that had already happened on the ranch, Terry feared the worst. He searched frantically around the corral. No tracks, no blood, no broken fencing, nothing. Then something caught his attention. Beside the corral sat an old livestock trailer that hadn't been used in years. The trailer was small, far too small to comfortably hold 4 mature breeding bulls. Almost on instinct, Terry climbed onto a nearby feed trough and peered through one of the dusty skylights in its roof. For a moment, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. All 4 bulls were inside. They stood shoulder to shoulder, packed tightly into the cramped trailer, with barely enough room to move. Even stranger, none of them reacted. The animals stood perfectly still. Their eyes appeared vacant. It was as though every one of them had fallen into some kind of hypnotic trance. "They're in here!" Terry shouted to Gwen. The sound of his voice seemed to break whatever strange state held them. Instantly, chaos erupted. The bulls suddenly became aware of their surroundings. They began kicking violently against the trailer walls. Metal groaned, wood splintered. The confined space exploded into frantic movement as nearly 5,000 pounds of terrified livestock struggled to escape. The trailer shook so violently that it looked ready to collapse. Finally, one of the rear doors burst open under the force of the charging animals. The bulls thundered out into the sunlight, scattering across the yard before slowing to a stop. Even after they escaped, they remained visibly distressed. It took Terry and Gwen nearly 2 exhausting hours of patient effort to calm the animals and guide them safely back into the corral. Only after the livestock had settled did the NIDS investigators begin carefully examining the trailer. What they discovered deepened the mystery. The trailer's only direct entrance from the corral was a side door. It had been wired shut for years. Old cobwebs stretched across both the frame and the wiring. The webs remained completely undisturbed. If that door had been opened recently, the delicate strands would have been broken. They weren't. The investigators inspected every inch of the trailer. No hidden openings, no damaged walls, no secret access points. From a practical standpoint, there appeared to be no possible way the 4 bulls could have entered. Even if someone somehow managed to open the trailer, another problem remained. Experienced ranchers agreed that forcing even a single aggressive breeding bull into such a confined space could require hours of dangerous work. Getting 4 mature breeding bulls to willingly crowd together inside that tiny trailer bordered on impossible. Yet somehow, there they had been, standing silently, motionless, as though they had simply awakened inside. While documenting the trailer, investigators noticed another unexpected anomaly. Sections of the metal corral nearby displayed unusually strong magnetic properties. Testing equipment confirmed that portions of the fencing had somehow become highly magnetized. No obvious source could explain the phenomenon. Even stranger, the magnetic effect gradually weakened over time before eventually disappearing altogether. The discovery prompted the NIDS team to begin conducting systematic magnetic field surveys across the entire ranch. For the first time since arriving, they believed they might be seeing the beginning of a measurable pattern. But they had no idea that another investigator would soon experience something deeply personal, an encounter involving an invisible presence, a strange musky odor, and a compass that refused to point north. Those events would push the investigation into even stranger territory than anyone had imagined.
Following the bizarre incident involving the 4 Black Angus bulls, the NIDS investigators intensified their work across the ranch. Every strange event was now being treated as a potential clue rather than an isolated mystery. Field notes became more detailed. Instruments remained active day and night. Every unusual reading was logged, no matter how insignificant it seemed. The unexplained magnetism discovered near the corral encouraged the team to expand their search for electromagnetic anomalies across the property. Portable magnetometers, compasses, and other scientific instruments accompanied investigators wherever they went. If an invisible force existed on the ranch, they hoped science might eventually detect it. For several weeks, however, little happened. The ranch settled into an uneasy calm. Then, later that month, Dr. Colm Kelleher experienced something that no instrument could fully explain. He had been investigating a set of unusual tracks discovered on the southern portion of the ranch. The impressions themselves were strange enough to warrant careful examination, and Kelleher spent the morning photographing them while documenting measurements and surrounding conditions. The weather was pleasant. Visibility was excellent. Nothing appeared out of the ordinary. Another member of the field team worked roughly 50 yards away, slowly making his way through a dense patch of Russian olive trees while conducting his own survey. As Kelleher continued examining the ground, something unexpected caught his attention. A powerful smell suddenly drifted through the air. It was thick, earthy, almost overpowering. Having spent months living and working on the ranch, he had grown familiar with every ordinary scent the landscape produced: livestock, damp soil, wild vegetation, and native wildlife. This odor was different. It wasn't one he recognized. He paused, expecting to locate its source, perhaps an animal carcass, a nearby predator, anything. But nothing around him seemed capable of producing such a strong musk.
Then another sensation appeared. Without warning, the hairs on the back of his neck stood upright. A cold chill spread through his body. Every instinct told him one thing: he wasn't alone. Someone or something was nearby. He slowly lifted his head and carefully scanned the surrounding landscape. The open pasture stretched quietly before him. The trees remained still. There was no visible movement, no animals, no people besides his fellow investigator. Yet the overwhelming sensation refused to disappear. It wasn't simple nervousness. It felt as though unseen eyes were fixed directly upon him, watching, studying, waiting. As a scientist, Kelleher immediately questioned his own reaction. Perhaps fatigue was affecting his judgment. Perhaps the isolation of the ranch was beginning to influence his imagination. Determined not to jump to conclusions, he forced himself to remain focused on the evidence in front of him. Gradually, the uneasy sensation began to fade. At nearly the same time, the strange musky odor slowly disappeared with it. Later that afternoon, after returning to regroup with the rest of the team, Kelleher casually mentioned the experience to the investigator who had been working nearby. The response caught him completely off guard. His colleague had experienced the exact same thing. He too had detected the unusual musky smell. He too had suddenly felt as though an unseen presence was silently observing him. But there was one additional detail. During the encounter, his field compass had begun behaving erratically. Instead of pointing north, the needle repeatedly swung toward the direction where the odor seemed strongest. Only after the smell vanished did the compass slowly return to normal. The coincidence was impossible to ignore. Two experienced investigators had independently reported nearly identical experiences within the same area at nearly the same time. Neither had discussed the incident until afterwards. Neither knew the other had felt the same overwhelming sensation. For the first time, the NIDS team believed they might be identifying a recurring pattern. Several previous incidents had also involved unexplained magnetic disturbances. The magnetized corral, unusual compass readings, and now this. Although none of these events proved what was happening on the ranch, they hinted that certain unexplained phenomena might somehow be associated with temporary magnetic interference. It wasn't enough to form a conclusion, but it was enough to justify closer attention. As spring turned into early summer, the investigation entered a new phase. The researchers had ruled out most conventional environmental explanations, yet instead of becoming less mysterious, the ranch seemed determined to reveal increasingly disturbing behavior. Something invisible appeared capable of influencing both animals and scientific instruments. Whether that force represented an unknown natural phenomenon or something far stranger remained completely unanswered. Then, in early June, two of the investigation's most respected scientists decided to spend another long night watching one of the ranch's most notorious locations. They hoped to document unusual activity. Instead, one of them would experience an encounter that left him questioning whether something on the ranch had briefly reached into his own mind.
By early June of 1997, the NIDS team had settled into a demanding routine of long stakeouts, endless observations, and constant data collection. Most nights passed quietly, but every investigator understood that the ranch had a habit of turning ordinary moments into unforgettable encounters without warning. Among the locations they monitored most closely was the abandoned Middle Homestead. The weathered structure had earned an unsettling reputation long before NIDS arrived. Numerous strange sightings had been reported there over the years, making it one of the primary observation points on the property. On one clear evening, physicist Dr. Eric Davis and biochemist Dr. Colm Kelleher positioned themselves near the old homestead shortly after sunset. The two scientists settled into another overnight surveillance operation. Their equipment surrounded them. Cameras were aimed toward the open pasture. Scientific sensors quietly recorded environmental conditions. A pair of dogs rested nearby, serving once again as biological early warning systems. Ahead of them stretched a wide field bordered by clusters of cottonwood and Russian olive trees. Everything appeared perfectly normal. For hours, almost nothing happened. The only sounds were insects, an occasional breeze moving through the grass, and the distant calls of nighttime wildlife. As midnight approached, both men continued their observations. Eric scanned the landscape using military-grade night vision goggles. Colm concentrated on taking long exposure photographs of the night sky, hoping to capture any unusual aerial activity. Then, without warning, the dogs reacted. Both animals suddenly whimpered. Instead of barking or running toward whatever had caught their attention, they pressed themselves tightly against the investigators' legs. Their bodies trembled, their tails tucked beneath them. Neither animal would look away from the distant tree line. At almost the exact same moment, Eric inhaled sharply. His breathing changed instantly. "Jesus," he whispered, "there's something over there." Colm lowered his camera. "What do you see?" Eric kept staring through the night vision goggles. "There's a huge black shape." His voice remained calm, but there was unmistakable tension beneath it. "It's standing near the trees, or maybe behind them. I can't tell." Colm strained his eyes toward the darkness. Without night vision equipment, he could see nothing except black silhouettes against an even darker sky. Still, he trusted Eric's observations. Instead of searching blindly, he aimed his camera toward the area Eric described and continued taking photographs. Eric never lowered the goggles. His breathing became increasingly uneven. "It's moving," he murmured, "slowly, north." For several seconds, neither scientist spoke. Then Eric suddenly stiffened. His posture changed completely. His shoulders locked. His voice dropped almost to a whisper. It's saying," he swallowed hard, "we are watching you." Colm immediately turned toward his colleague. "What?" But Eric seemed barely aware he had spoken. His eyes remained fixed behind the goggles. His breathing grew faster. Again and again he quietly muttered, "Jesus Christ! Jesus Christ!" The repetition continued for several moments. Colm had known Eric as a highly disciplined physicist, a man whose career had been built on mathematics, engineering, and rigorous scientific thinking. Watching him react this way was deeply unsettling. It didn't resemble fear alone. It looked as though he was struggling against something he couldn't explain. Finally, Eric relaxed slightly. The tension left his shoulders. He slowly lowered the goggles. "It's leaving," he said quietly. "It's moving away." The encounter had lasted only a few minutes, yet both investigators understood something unusual had occurred. As they packed their equipment, Colm noticed something unusual. Eric remained far quieter than normal. Even after the encounter had ended, he seemed distracted, deep in thought, occasionally glancing into the darkness outside the truck's windows, as though expecting to see something following them. Whatever he believed had happened in those trees had clearly affected him more deeply than he wished to admit. The experience became another carefully documented report within the growing collection of unexplained events occurring on the ranch. Still, no photographs captured the mysterious figure. No instrument confirmed what Eric believed he had seen. The evidence remained frustratingly incomplete. Yet one fact became increasingly difficult for the investigators to ignore. Nearly every strange event seemed to stay just beyond the reach of definitive proof. The phenomenon always appeared briefly, then vanished. As summer continued, the mysterious glowing orbs returned more frequently than ever before. Night after night, investigators chased them across fields and hillsides, but the lights always stayed one step ahead, and before long, another surveillance operation would produce one of the most terrifying encounters anyone on the ranch had ever witnessed. An encounter involving what appeared to be a doorway opening into somewhere that should not exist. As the summer of 1997 progressed, the strange activity across the ranch intensified once again. By now, the NIDS investigators had grown accustomed to seeing mysterious glowing orbs drifting silently over the property. They appeared without warning, hovered for only a few moments, and then vanished before anyone could get close enough to study them. The lights seemed almost playful. Whenever investigators rushed toward one sighting, another would suddenly appear somewhere else on the ranch. Teams spent countless nights driving from one hotspot to another, chasing glowing objects that always remained just beyond reach. No matter how carefully surveillance operations were planned, the phenomenon always seemed to anticipate their movements. It was as though something on the ranch understood exactly where every camera was pointed. Every successful observation only generated more questions. Then, during one August stakeout, events took an even stranger turn. It was approximately 3:30 in the morning. Two NIDS investigators had positioned themselves atop a ridge overlooking the infamous Middle Homestead. The location had already become one of the most active areas on the property, making it an ideal place for overnight surveillance. One investigator, Mike, carried a pair of infrared binoculars capable of detecting heat signatures invisible to the naked eye. His partner, Jim, monitored scientific instruments and environmental sensors while keeping watch over the surrounding landscape. For nearly 3 hours, nothing unusual happened. The darkness remained quiet. The instruments showed nothing out of the ordinary. The investigators were beginning to consider ending their observation and moving to another location. Then Mike suddenly froze. "Hold on." His voice was barely over a whisper. "I've got something." Jim immediately looked toward the pasture below. At first, he noticed only a faint glow hovering near the ground. It wasn't especially bright. In fact, it looked like little more than a dim patch of light. But through Mike's infrared binoculars, the object appeared completely different. "It's incredibly bright," Mike said, "almost as bright as the full moon." The glowing object hovered roughly 3 feet above the ground, completely motionless. For several moments, the investigators simply watched. Then the light began to change. "It's getting bigger," Mike said quietly. His voice carried both curiosity and uncertainty. The circular glow slowly expanded. Its edges sharpened. The center no longer looked solid. Instead, it appeared strangely hollow. Mike leaned forward slightly, struggling to understand what he was seeing. Then his breathing stopped. "No." Jim looked at him. "What is it?" Mike never lowered the binoculars. "It's not just a light." There was a long pause. "It's a tunnel." Jim frowned. "A tunnel? I can see straight through it." His words came slowly, almost as though he couldn't believe them himself. "It looks like there's another place on the other side." Jim immediately asked if he could use the binoculars. Mike didn't respond. His entire attention remained fixed on the glowing opening below. Seconds later, his voice became tense. "There's something moving." Jim's heartbeat quickened. "What do you mean?" Mike swallowed. "There's something inside it." Neither man moved. The night suddenly felt unnaturally still. "It's crawling." Mike's voice was now trembling. "It's coming through." According to what he later reported, a massive black figure slowly emerged from inside the glowing opening. The creature wasn't walking. It pulled itself forward on its elbows and knees, dragging its body across the ground as though climbing out from somewhere beyond the visible world. It possessed no clear facial features, no recognizable clothing, only the dark outline of an enormous humanoid form. For several terrifying moments, the figure remained low to the ground. Then it rose. Without hesitation, it sprinted toward the ridge. The speed was astonishing, far faster than any human should have been able to run across such rough terrain. Jim couldn't clearly see the figure itself, but suddenly both investigators heard it. Heavy footsteps, sharp crunches echoed through the loose shale scattered across the hillside. Something large was charging uphill. The sound grew louder, closer, closer still. Within seconds, whatever it was passed approximately 30 feet from where the investigators stood, yet neither man could clearly identify it in the darkness. They heard it, they sensed it, but they could barely see anything at all. Then, just as suddenly as it had arrived, the footsteps stopped. The darkness swallowed everything. The strange silence that followed felt almost unnatural. Even the insects had stopped making noise. Neither investigator spoke. They simply stood frozen, listening. Then another familiar detail returned. A powerful, musky odor drifted across the ridge. It was the same unusual scent reported during previous unexplained encounters on the ranch. The smell lingered only briefly before fading into the night air. Eventually, the ordinary sounds of nature returned. The investigators remained at their position for several more minutes, struggling to process what had just happened. When they finally returned to the observation trailer, every detail of the encounter was documented while still fresh in their memories. No photograph captured the tunnel, no video recorded the creature. Only the investigators' testimony and the strange consistency with earlier reports connected everything else unfolding across the ranch. By now, the similarities were becoming impossible to ignore. Glowing orbs, unexplained magnetic disturbances, massive unidentified creatures, the recurring musky odor, animals sensing danger before people, and now, a portal-like opening witnessed through infrared optics. The investigation was no longer centered on isolated mysteries. Instead, it appeared that every bizarre event might somehow be connected. Over the following months, the NIDS team would witness many more incidents: flying objects, disturbing animal behavior, unexplained sounds beneath the ground, and strange disturbances that challenged every scientific explanation they could devise. With each passing week, even the most skeptical investigators found it increasingly difficult to dismiss what they were experiencing. The ranch seemed determined to reveal just enough to keep them searching, while never allowing them to uncover the complete truth.
As 1997 continued, the NIDS investigators found themselves trapped in a frustrating cycle. Every week brought fresh reports of bizarre activity, yet every attempt to obtain undeniable scientific proof seemed to fail. It wasn't because the team lacked equipment or experience. Their cameras, environmental sensors, radiation detectors, magnetic field meters, infrared optics, and recording systems operated around the clock. The problem was something else entirely. Whatever was responsible for the strange events appeared to behave intelligently. Again and again, investigators would receive reports of glowing orbs moving across a distant pasture. By the time they reached the location, the lights had already vanished. Minutes later, another team on the opposite side of the ranch would report seeing similar objects. When investigators rushed there, the lights disappeared once more. Night after night, they chased these mysterious glowing spheres from one end of the property to the other, but the phenomenon always seemed to stay just beyond their reach. It almost felt deliberate. Some members of the team quietly joked that the ranch itself seemed to be playing a game with them. Yet behind those nervous smiles was genuine frustration. Scientific investigations depend on repeatable observations, but nothing on the ranch behaved consistently. An event might occur once and never happen in exactly the same way again. If it did repeat, it would usually appear somewhere completely different where no cameras had been placed. Even the timing seemed impossible to predict. Hours could pass without a single unusual occurrence. Then, the moment investigators shifted positions or stopped watching one area, activity would suddenly begin there. More than once, strange events reportedly unfolded just outside the field of view of surveillance cameras. By the time operators redirected their equipment, everything had already ended. To experienced researchers, the pattern became increasingly unsettling. It was almost as though something understood where every observer stood. Equipment failures only added to their problems. On several occasions, cameras malfunctioned moments before unexplained activity occurred. Batteries that had tested fully charged suddenly drained without warning. Recording devices froze. Electronic sensors produced inconsistent readings before returning to normal with no obvious cause. Technicians carefully inspected the equipment afterwards, but often found no mechanical explanation for the failures. As the months passed, investigators documented far more than mysterious lights. Reports included unusual underground sounds that resembled distant machinery or heavy movement beneath the earth.
Witnesses occasionally described hearing deep rumbling vibrations traveling through the ground without any visible source. Magnetic anomalies continued appearing in different locations across the ranch. Animals frequently reacted before investigators noticed anything unusual. Dogs sometimes refused to leave their kennels. Livestock became agitated without any apparent reason. Wildlife avoided certain areas entirely. To the NIDS team, these behavioral changes became valuable warning signs. Whenever the animals behaved strangely, investigators immediately increased their level of observation. In several cases, unusual activity followed shortly afterward. Despite everything the researchers experienced, they remained committed to the scientific method. Every witness statement was compared against environmental data. Every unusual event was carefully documented. Investigators challenged one another's observations, looking for mistakes, misunderstandings, or ordinary explanations. No one wanted to reach extraordinary conclusions without compelling evidence, yet the evidence itself continued to raise impossible questions. The longer the investigation continued, the more difficult it became for even the most skeptical scientists to dismiss the experiences as coincidence. Many had arrived believing they would eventually expose natural causes behind the reports. Instead, they found themselves documenting events that seemed to defy conventional understanding. Still, one major problem remained. Eyewitness testimony alone could never satisfy the scientific community. Without clear photographic or physical evidence, extraordinary claims would always face skepticism. And that became perhaps the greatest challenge of the entire investigation. The phenomenon rarely allowed itself to be recorded clearly. Whenever cameras succeeded in capturing something unusual, the footage often showed little more than distant lights floating against a dark sky. Without nearby landmarks or additional context, the recordings appeared unimpressive. To outside observers, they looked like ordinary points of light. Only those present during the events understood how extraordinary the experiences had actually been. As months turned into more than a year, the investigators slowly reached a troubling conclusion. They weren't simply studying an unexplained location. They might be interacting with something capable of observing them in return. That possibility would eventually influence how Robert Bigelow himself described the mystery. But before those conclusions emerged, the activity across the ranch would begin to change once again. By the middle of 1998, the relentless wave of bizarre encounters that had dominated the investigation started fading. The silence that followed would prove almost as mysterious as the phenomenon itself.
By the middle of 1998, the atmosphere on Skinwalker Ranch began to change in a way that surprised everyone involved in the investigation. For nearly 2 years, the property had produced a relentless stream of bizarre encounters. Investigators had documented unexplained lights, mysterious creatures, strange magnetic disturbances, unsettling odors, missing livestock, cattle mutilations, and countless eyewitness accounts that challenged conventional understanding. Then, almost without warning, the activity slowed. At first, no one paid much attention. Periods of quiet had happened before, usually lasting a few days before another extraordinary event occurred. The investigators assumed this was simply another temporary lull. But the days stretched into weeks. The weeks became months. Reports of unusual phenomena grew increasingly rare. The glowing orbs that had once appeared almost nightly became infrequent. The strange sounds beneath the ground were heard less often. The animals gradually returned to more natural behavior. Even the investigators noticed a subtle change in the atmosphere. The overwhelming feeling that they were constantly being watched seemed to fade. Although isolated incidents still occurred from time to time, the intense concentration of unexplained events that had defined the previous years had largely disappeared. NIDEs continued maintaining a presence on the ranch. Observation posts remained active. Scientific equipment stayed in operation. Researchers continued documenting every unusual report with the same discipline they had practiced from the beginning. Yet despite their persistence, the extraordinary activity never fully returned to its earlier intensity. For several more years, the investigation continued. The organization refused to abandon the project simply because the phenomenon had become quieter. If anything, the silence presented another mystery. Why had the activity declined? What had changed? Had whatever intelligence seemed to inhabit the ranch simply lost interest? Or had the constant scientific observation somehow altered its behavior? No one could answer those questions. By 2004, after nearly a decade of research, Robert Bigelow and the NIDE's organization made a difficult decision. The investigation would come to an end. The field teams packed their equipment. Observation trailers were removed. Scientific instruments that had monitored the property day and night were dismantled. One by one, the investigators left the ranch. Although the project had generated an enormous collection of reports, photographs, environmental data, laboratory analyses, witness interviews, and field notes, it had not produced the kind of undeniable evidence required to fully explain what had taken place. To many outside observers, this appeared to be a failure. Critics argued that after spending years investigating the ranch, NIDEs had failed to prove anything extraordinary. On the surface, that criticism seemed reasonable. The researchers had not captured crystal-clear footage of unknown creatures. They had not recovered advanced technology. They had not identified a single definitive cause behind the countless reports. Yet the field investigators themselves viewed the outcome differently. They acknowledged that many of their recordings were frustratingly inconclusive. Several cameras had captured glowing lights moving across the property. Some footage had even been recorded during Terry Sherman's ownership of the ranch. Later, portions of these recordings would appear in Jeremy Corbell's documentary Hunt for the Skinwalker, inspired by the research documented by Dr. Colm Kelleher and journalist George Knapp. Yet there was an unavoidable limitation. Most recordings had been made at night. As a result, the cameras often captured only small, distant points of light against a dark background. Without clear detail or scale, the footage appeared underwhelming to anyone who had not witnessed the events firsthand. When reviewed by the NID's advisory board, much of the video evidence was judged insufficient to support extraordinary conclusions. It simply lacked the clarity demanded by rigorous scientific standards. Despite that disappointment, the field investigators believed they had learned something important. Throughout the investigation, they repeatedly noticed a remarkable pattern. The phenomenon appeared to resist observation. Whenever cameras were perfectly positioned, nothing happened. When unusual events finally occurred, they often unfolded just beyond the camera's viewing angles. If investigators rushed toward one location, activity shifted somewhere else. Equipment malfunctioned at precisely the wrong moments. Batteries failed unexpectedly. Electronic devices behaved unpredictably. Events unfolded too quickly to document properly. To many members of the team, these repeated patterns no longer seemed like coincidence. Robert Bigelow eventually described the force behind the ranch as something resembling a precognitive intelligent presence, a phenomenon that appeared aware of those attempting to study it. Whether that interpretation was correct remained impossible to prove, but after years of first-hand experience, several investigators privately admitted that they found it difficult to believe otherwise. The mystery never behaved like a simple environmental anomaly. It often reacted as though it understood exactly what the investigators were trying to accomplish. Even after NIDEs officially ended their field operations, one fact remained undeniable. Hundreds of eyewitness accounts continued to exist, not only from the Sherman family, not only from NIDE's investigators, but also from neighboring ranchers, longtime residents of the Uinta Basin, law enforcement officers, visitors, and numerous independent witnesses whose stories stretched back decades and, in some cases, generations.
Whatever explanation ultimately proved correct, the mystery had become far larger than one family or one scientific investigation. The question was no longer whether strange stories existed. The real question was, what could possibly explain them? That mystery would lead researchers, skeptics, and believers alike into a series of competing theories, each attempting to answer one of the most enduring paranormal questions in modern history.
With the field investigation complete, attention shifted from documenting strange events to answering an even more difficult question. What, if anything, had actually been happening on Skinwalker Ranch? The reports collected over the years were extraordinary. Witnesses described glowing aerial objects, unexplained animal deaths, strange creatures, unusual magnetic effects, mysterious odors, disappearing livestock, and experiences that seemed to challenge ordinary reality. But extraordinary claims naturally invite extraordinary skepticism. The first possibility many people considered was the simplest. Could the entire story have been an elaborate hoax? Some skeptics argued that the Terry and Gwen Sherman invented bizarre stories to escape a ranch that had become a financial burden. After losing livestock and facing serious economic hardship, perhaps creating sensational claims would make it easier to sell the property. At first glance, that explanation sounded reasonable, but when investigators examined it more closely, several problems appeared. If the Shermans had fabricated the story, they would have risked damaging their own reputation within the ranching community. Stories involving monsters, UFOs, and unexplained creatures could easily have made neighbors question their credibility rather than sympathize with them. Even more importantly, attaching such bizarre claims to a property would likely reduce its market value rather than increase it. There was also another obstacle to the hoax theory. Long before the Sherman family ever arrived, people living throughout the Uinta Basin had reported unusual lights, strange aerial objects, mysterious animals, and other unexplained experiences. Some of those accounts stretched back generations. Neighbors living near the ranch described incidents remarkably similar to those reported by the Shermans. If those earlier witnesses were telling the truth, then the phenomenon clearly existed before Terry and Gwen ever purchased the land. That made it difficult to argue that the entire mystery had been invented by a single family. Another point frequently raised involved Robert Bigelow himself. He invested millions of dollars purchasing the ranch and funding nearly a decade of scientific investigation. It would have been an extraordinary commitment if he believed the entire story was nothing more than a fabrication. Nor were the investigators easily fooled. Most members of NIDS entered the project with skeptical mindsets. Many initially expected to uncover ordinary explanations. Instead, several eventually reported witnessing unusual events firsthand. Another criticism suggested that journalist George Knapp and Robert Bigelow exaggerated the mystery in hopes of turning the ranch into a profitable tourist attraction. However, that theory also faced significant challenges. After purchasing the property, Bigelow did not develop it into an entertainment destination. Visitors were not encouraged to explore the ranch. Public access remained tightly restricted. For approximately 20 years, very little about the property changed beyond increased security measures. Rather than promoting tourism, the owners appeared far more interested in protecting the location from unwanted attention. That behavior seemed inconsistent with a commercial publicity campaign. Another proposed explanation centered on psychology. Perhaps witnesses experienced some form of shared delusion. Could isolation, stress, expectation, or suggestion have influenced large numbers of people into believing they had witnessed extraordinary events? The NIDS investigators took that possibility seriously. Psychological evaluations formed part of their research from the beginning.
Yet after years of interviews and observations, no consistent psychological profile emerged. Witnesses came from different professions, educational backgrounds, ages, and belief systems. Some strongly believed in the paranormal. Others openly dismissed such ideas before their own experiences. No common factor explained why so many unrelated individuals reported similar events. Even more problematic for the psychological explanation was the physical evidence left behind. Missing livestock, unusual footprints, cattle mutilations, temporary magnetic anomalies, damaged animals. These weren't simply personal perceptions or emotional experiences. Something tangible had occurred, even if its cause remained uncertain. For many people who accepted that unusual phenomena genuinely occurred on the ranch, the next obvious possibility involved extraterrestrial visitors. After all, countless witnesses had described unidentified flying objects hovering over the property. Some even reported structured craft displaying flight characteristics unlike conventional aircraft. Could the ranch have served as a landing site, or perhaps a place of ongoing alien activity? The theory certainly attracted attention, yet the physical evidence gathered by NIDS complicated that explanation as well. Whenever physical materials associated with unusual events were recovered and analyzed, laboratory testing consistently revealed ordinary terrestrial characteristics. Nothing conclusively pointed toward technology or materials originating beyond Earth. While this did not completely eliminate the extraterrestrial hypothesis, it failed to provide direct support for it either. As each possible explanation was carefully examined, new questions continued replacing old ones. Instead of narrowing the mystery, every investigation seemed to reveal just how many possibilities remained. And among those possibilities was one rooted not in modern science, but in centuries-old Native American traditions surrounding mysterious beings known as skinwalkers.
As conventional explanations became increasingly difficult to defend, researchers were forced to examine ideas that would normally fall far outside the boundaries of mainstream science. One of the oldest theories connected to the ranch came from Native American traditions. For generations, stories had circulated throughout the Uinta Basin describing the land as spiritually troubled. According to local accounts, long before modern ranches were built, tensions between different indigenous nations had left deep scars across the region. Among the most frequently repeated legends was the belief that the Navajo had placed a powerful curse upon the land after being driven from northeastern Utah. Members of the Ute Nation preserved stories warning people to avoid certain areas where dark forces were believed to roam. Whether these stories reflected historical events, symbolic beliefs, or folklore passed down through generations remained impossible to verify. However, many people noticed intriguing similarities between the traditional descriptions and the strange reports emerging from Skinwalker Ranch. In Native American lore, skinwalkers were often portrayed as dangerous beings capable of extraordinary abilities. Some stories describe them appearing as enormous animals. Others suggested they could move with unnatural speed, manipulate fear, or appear and disappear without warning. A few witnesses believed the giant wolf-like creature Terry Sherman encountered resembled these ancient descriptions. Yet the comparison was far from perfect. The ranch produced far more than reports of unusual creatures. There were glowing aerial objects, magnetic disturbances, animal mutilations, possible portal-like phenomena, unexplained lights, invisible presences. No single legend seemed capable of accounting for every category of activity reported on the property. If Native American traditions contained part of the answer, they almost certainly did not explain the entire mystery. Another theory focused not on ancient legends, but on modern technology. From the beginning, Terry Sherman had privately suspected military involvement.
He never embraced the idea that extraterrestrials were responsible for what he experienced. Instead, he believed secret government experiments might somehow explain the bizarre activity. The ranch's isolated location made that possibility attractive to some researchers. Far from major population centers, the surrounding landscape offered privacy that could potentially support classified testing programs. Some theorized that advanced military technology, perhaps involving surveillance systems, directed energy, psychological experiments, or electromagnetic research, might account for at least some of the strange reports. If so, the Sherman family could have become unwilling participants in highly classified operations without ever realizing it. Although no direct evidence confirmed such activities, the possibility remained part of the broader discussion. During the investigation, members of the NIDS Advisory Board explored another controversial approach. They consulted several individuals who claimed to possess abilities in remote viewing. Remote viewing is the alleged ability to mentally perceive distant locations or events without physically visiting them. The subject has remained controversial for decades. Nevertheless, it attracted serious attention during the Cold War when U.S. intelligence agencies sponsored research programs exploring whether the technique possessed any practical value. Curious to see whether independent remote viewers might report similar impressions, NIDS arranged several controlled sessions. The first participant received almost no background information about the ranch. Despite that limitation, the viewer reportedly produced a sketch bearing a striking resemblance to the property's layout. The drawing included major landmarks such as the homesteads, the creek, the canal, and the surrounding ridge. The viewer also identified an area in the southwestern section of the ranch, describing it as containing an unusual energy field associated with deeply disturbing impressions. Another remote viewer independently focused attention on the second homestead. According to that individual, strange energy vortices appeared concentrated around the building where many of the ranch's most disturbing experiences had reportedly occurred. A separate exercise involved asking a remote viewer to describe the mysterious daytime mutilation of the Black Angus calf. Rather than seeing an ordinary predator, the viewer claimed to perceive an unusual drone-like presence associated with another dimension and somehow connected to military activity. Whether these impressions held any factual value remained impossible to determine. Still, they introduced another layer of mystery into an investigation already filled with unanswered questions. Later remote viewing sessions involving multiple participants produced even stranger descriptions. Several independent individuals reported impressions of underground structures beneath portions of the ranch. Some described extensive networks of equipment buried below the surface. Others believed military personnel were somehow involved. A few even reported symbolic images associated with naval operations and advanced technology. None of these claims could be independently verified. They remained speculative observations rather than scientific evidence. Yet the remarkable consistency between some participants continued to intrigue those studying the ranch. Despite years of investigation, every possible explanation seemed to answer only part of the mystery, while leaving many questions unresolved. If military technology played a role, how could it explain reports dating back centuries? If ancient legends contained the answer, what accounted for modern sightings of structured aerial craft? And if neither explanation was sufficient, what else could possibly connect every strange event witnessed on Skinwalker Ranch? The theories were about to become even more extraordinary. Some researchers would eventually suggest that the ranch itself might function as something far stranger than a haunted property, perhaps as a gateway between entirely different realities.
As investigators exhausted one theory after another, some researchers began considering an idea that sounded more like science fiction than science. What if Skinwalker Ranch wasn't simply the site of isolated paranormal events? What if it functioned as a location where entirely different realities occasionally intersected? This hypothesis attempted to explain something that none of the earlier theories could fully address. Over the years, witnesses had reported an astonishing variety of phenomena. There were glowing aerial objects that maneuvered in impossible ways, towering wolf-like creatures that appeared and disappeared without leaving normal tracks, unexplained cattle mutilations carried out with extraordinary precision, invisible presences that seemed capable of influencing human emotions, temporary magnetic anomalies, strange underground sounds, portal-like structures, and countless other events that refused to fit into a single category. Ordinarily, investigators might have assumed these reports represented unrelated mysteries, but on Skinwalker Ranch, they often occurred in the same locations, involved the same witnesses, and appeared during the same periods of heightened activity. That unusual overlap led some researchers to wonder whether all of these seemingly unrelated events shared one common source. Rather than viewing UFOs, cryptid creatures, poltergeist-like disturbances, and other unexplained experiences as separate mysteries, perhaps they represented different expressions of the same underlying phenomenon. According to this idea, the ranch might occasionally allow something to cross into our world from somewhere else. Not necessarily another planet, perhaps another dimension, or another reality existing alongside our own. If such openings appeared only briefly, they might explain why investigators rarely captured clear evidence. The phenomena could arrive suddenly, remain visible for only moments, then disappear before meaningful documentation became possible. Some supporters of this hypothesis pointed to the strange tunnel reportedly observed through infrared optics during the August 1997 stakeout. Others referenced repeated accounts of glowing orbs seemingly materializing from nowhere before vanishing just as mysteriously. While no scientific evidence confirmed the existence of interdimensional gateways, the theory attempted to connect many otherwise unrelated reports into a single framework. Interestingly, several remote viewers also described the ranch using language that suggested boundaries between different realities were somehow weaker there. Many reported feelings of overwhelming darkness. Others sensed death, fear, or powerful unseen forces surrounding the property. Although these impressions remained entirely subjective, they echoed emotional reactions independently described by numerous eyewitnesses over the years. Still, even if one accepted the possibility of another dimension, another important question remained unanswered. Whatever intelligence appeared responsible for the strange activity displayed remarkable selectivity. It seemed capable of distinguishing between people and animals. Despite years of extraordinary reports, no visitor or investigator was ever confirmed to have been physically attacked or killed by the phenomenon itself. The same could not be said for animals. Cats disappeared. Dogs vanished under disturbing circumstances. Livestock suffered mysterious mutilations. Wild animals were reportedly found dead without obvious explanations. The apparent intelligence behind these events seemed to target animals repeatedly while leaving humans largely unharmed. That contrast fascinated investigators. If an intelligent force truly existed, why would it behave this way? Some believed the phenomenon simply had no interest in harming people. Others argued that psychological intimidation may have been its primary objective. The Sherman family frequently described feeling emotionally tormented rather than physically threatened. Many NIDS investigators later admitted experiencing similar sensations. There were moments when private conversations appeared strangely reflected in later events. One example remained especially memorable. Only an hour before Terry's 4 valuable Black Angus bulls mysteriously disappeared from the corral, Gwen had quietly expressed her fear that something terrible might happen to them. Soon afterward, the impossible incident unfolded.
To some investigators, the timing felt far too precise to dismiss as coincidence. It almost suggested that whatever intelligence occupied the ranch had somehow overheard or perhaps even understood their conversation. Whether that interpretation was correct remained impossible to prove, yet experiences like these gradually changed how many investigators viewed the phenomenon. Instead of behaving like random natural events, the activity often appeared deliberate, sometimes playful, sometimes deceptive, occasionally almost mischievous, as though an unseen intelligence enjoyed confusing those attempting to understand it. That perception became increasingly common among both the Sherman family and members of the NIDS team. Years later, many still struggled to describe exactly what they believed they had encountered. One thing, however, seemed increasingly clear. If an intelligence truly existed on the ranch, its motives remained completely unknown. It demonstrated awareness, it manipulated attention, it repeatedly avoided direct observation, yet it never clearly revealed its purpose. And after decades of speculation, that unanswered question remained perhaps the greatest mystery of all. Eventually, the Sherman family chose to leave those questions behind forever. They accepted that some mysteries might never be solved. But the story of Skinwalker Ranch itself was far from over, because long after they moved away, the ranch would once again awaken.
More than 2 decades have passed since Terry and Gwen finally walked away from the ranch that had transformed their dream into a nightmare. After leaving Utah, they settled in Idaho, determined to rebuild their lives far from the place that had consumed their peace of mind. Friends later said the family rarely spoke publicly about those difficult years. They had accepted a painful reality. They might never discover what had truly happened on their property. For the Shermans, moving away wasn't simply a change of address. It was an attempt to leave behind years of fear, unanswered questions, and emotional exhaustion. Robert Bigelow, however, wasn't ready to abandon the mystery. Even after the NIDS investigation officially ended in 2004, he retained ownership of the ranch. The property remained heavily secured and access was tightly restricted. Although occasional reports of unusual activity continued to surface throughout the 2000s, they were generally less frequent and less dramatic than the extraordinary wave of events documented during the mid to late 1990s. To many observers, it seemed as though the phenomenon had gone dormant. Whether the activity had truly diminished or simply become less visible remained impossible to determine. Then, in 2016, another major chapter in the ranch's history began. Bigelow sold the property to Adamantium Real Estate, but the sale came with one important condition: scientific research was to continue. The ranch would not become a tourist attraction or commercial development. Instead, it would remain a place dedicated to investigating the unexplained. Remarkably, soon after the ownership changed, reports of unusual activity increased once again. Witnesses described unidentified aerial objects appearing above the ranch. Some of these sightings were reportedly photographed directly over the homestead. Investigators and visitors once again began discussing mysterious lights, unexplained equipment failures, strange environmental effects, and other anomalies that echoed the stories from years earlier. The renewed activity attracted worldwide attention. Documentaries, books, television series, podcasts, and investigative reports introduced Skinwalker Ranch to millions of people who had never heard of the Sherman family's ordeal. One of the most widely discussed documentaries was filmmaker Jeremy Corbell's documentary Hunt for the Skinwalker, inspired by the earlier research documented by Dr. Colm Kelleher and journalist George Knapp. During the documentary, Corbell asked the ranch's new owner a simple but revealing question. "What do you say to people who believe none of this is real?" The response was short, direct, and unforgettable. "You're delusional."
Whether viewers agreed with that statement or not, it reflected the confidence of someone who believed the mystery was genuine. Still, belief alone has never been enough to satisfy science. Despite decades of investigations, thousands of witness reports, countless hours of surveillance, and millions of dollars spent searching for answers, no universally accepted explanation has emerged. Some researchers continue exploring environmental causes. Others favor classified military technology. Some remain convinced the activity involves unidentified aerial phenomena. Others point toward Native American traditions, interdimensional theories, or entirely unknown natural processes that modern science has yet to understand. Each explanation answers certain questions. Each leaves many others unresolved. Perhaps that is why Skinwalker Ranch continues to fascinate people around the world. It occupies a rare place where folklore, eyewitness testimony, scientific investigation, and modern mystery all intersect. For skeptics, it serves as a reminder that extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence. For believers, it represents one of the strongest collections of unexplained eyewitness accounts ever assembled in a single location. For scientists, it remains a puzzle that refuses to fit comfortably within existing models. And for everyone else, it remains one of the most enduring unsolved mysteries of modern times. Yet one final question still remains. After everything that has happened, after every investigation, every theory, every witness, what should we ultimately believe? That answer is left to each person who examines the evidence. Because the final chapter of Skinwalker Ranch isn't about proving a single theory. It's about understanding why this isolated piece of land continues to challenge everything we think we know about reality itself. The story may be unfinished, but the search for the truth continues.
In the end, Skinwalker Ranch remains one of the most thoroughly investigated and yet least understood locations associated with unexplained phenomena. Few places in modern history have inspired such an unusual combination of eyewitness testimony, scientific inquiry, folklore, and public fascination. The story began with a family searching for a better future. Terry and Gwen Sherman purchased what they believed was an ordinary cattle ranch, hoping years of hard work would provide stability for themselves and their children. Instead, they found themselves caught in a series of events that steadily eroded their sense of security. At first, the incident seemed isolated. Then they became impossible to ignore. Strange lights crossed the sky. Animals behaved as though unseen predators surrounded them. Livestock vanished without explanation. Others were discovered under circumstances that defied conventional veterinary knowledge. Towering creatures appeared in the darkness. Invisible presences seemed to observe those who entered the property. Magnetic anomalies emerged without warning. And on more than one occasion, investigators reported experiences they struggled to explain even to themselves. What makes the Skinwalker Ranch story especially compelling is not simply the extraordinary nature of these claims. It is the diversity of the people making them. Experienced ranchers, scientists, veterinarians, physicists, biochemists, security personnel, neighbors, visitors. Many arrived with completely different backgrounds, expectations, and beliefs. Some were openly skeptical. Others had no previous interest in paranormal subjects whatsoever. Yet over the years, a surprising number described events they could not easily dismiss. That does not automatically prove every claim was accurate. Human perception is imperfect. Memories can change. Extraordinary situations often produce extraordinary interpretations. Science demands caution, careful testing, and repeatable evidence. Those principles remain essential.
At the same time, dismissing every eyewitness account without examination would ignore the very purpose of scientific investigation. Curiosity begins by asking difficult questions, not by assuming the answers. The work carried out by NIDS reflected that philosophy. Its investigators spent years attempting to eliminate ordinary explanations before considering extraordinary possibilities. They tested environmental conditions, they analyzed biological evidence, they examined psychological factors, they reviewed every report with professional skepticism. Although they never reached a definitive conclusion, they left behind one of the largest collections of documented observations ever assembled at a single allegedly paranormal location. Perhaps future technology will someday provide answers unavailable to investigators in the 1990s. More sensitive instruments, advanced imaging systems, artificial intelligence capable of identifying patterns hidden within decades of collected data. Or perhaps future researchers will discover entirely natural explanations for events that currently appear mysterious. That possibility should never be dismissed. History has repeatedly shown that yesterday's mysteries sometimes become tomorrow's science. Yet another possibility also remains. Perhaps certain aspects of reality simply lie beyond our present understanding, not supernatural, not impossible, merely unexplored. Throughout history, many discoveries once considered unbelievable eventually became accepted facts after better evidence emerged. Whether Skinwalker Ranch belongs in that category, or whether it represents a remarkable collection of misunderstandings and coincidences, remains unknown. For now, the evidence continues to support one undeniable conclusion. Something unusual convinced an experienced ranching family to abandon the home they had worked so hard to build. Something persuaded a billionaire to invest millions of dollars into one of the longest private investigations of unexplained phenomena ever conducted. Something motivated respected scientists to spend years documenting experiences they never expected to encounter. Exactly what that something was, no one can say with certainty. Today, the ranch still stands beneath the wide skies of northeastern Utah. The fences remain, the homesteads endure, the winds still sweep across the same open fields where so many extraordinary stories began. Whether those stories describe misunderstood natural events, advanced human technology, psychological phenomena, folklore brought to life through belief, or something science has yet to identify, is a question that remains unanswered. And perhaps that uncertainty is the true legacy of Skinwalker Ranch. It reminds us that the world still contains places capable of challenging our assumptions, places where evidence and mystery exist side by side, places where every answer seems to generate even more questions. Until stronger evidence finally emerges, the debate will continue. Believers will see confirmation, skeptics will ask for better proof, researchers will keep searching, and the ranch itself will continue standing silently at the center of one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of our time. Whatever the truth may ultimately be, one fact is certain: the search for answers is far from over. And perhaps somewhere beneath the endless Utah sky, the next discovery is simply waiting for the right moment to reveal itself.